I was 29 when I left my cushy software job to pursue a dream. It wasn't a spontaneous decision. I had been toying with the idea for years, sketching wireframes on napkins, saving every dollar I could, and watching YouTube interviews of startup founders late into the night. The idea of building something from scratch, of creating a solution that could outlive me, kept me awake more often than coffee did. In the beginning, I worked out of my parents' garage. It smelled of old paint and gasoline, but it was quiet. Just me, my laptop, and the echo of my ambition. I wrote code from dusk till dawn, surviving on instant noodles and the occasional phone call from my worried mother. I didn't have much, but I had purpose. That purpose burned like a fire in my chest, giving me the stamina to keep going even when the nights felt endless. But passion alone couldn't build a company. I needed help, someone with business acumen, someone who could speak investor language and navigate the corporate landscape while I focused on the product. That's when Alina came into the picture. We met at a local startup networking event. She was magnetic, dressed sharply, speaking confidently about market penetration strategies and financial models. She caught the attention of every room she walked into. Our first conversation was short but electric. She asked intelligent questions about FinMap, pointed out weaknesses I hadn't considered, and suggested solutions that made instant sense. Within a week, we met again, then again. Soon, she was spending evenings with me in that same dusty garage, flipping through user personas, discussing product-market fit, helping craft a pitch deck. We were two misfits with aligned visions, and that made us unstoppable. Alina officially joined as my co-founder 3 months in. While I handled the backend and infrastructure, she took charge of branding, fundraising, and outreach. With her in the picture, things started to move. She had charisma and connections. She set up meetings with angel investors who would have never returned my cold emails. She spoke in boardrooms while I kept tweaking code, optimizing features, fixing bugs no one even noticed. But I didn't mind. In fact, I was grateful. We made a good team. More than that, I trusted her, maybe too much. As the months passed, our working relationship grew deeper. She wasn't just a partner in business. She became my confidant. We shared meals, walked through the park after long meetings, celebrated small wins like they were major victories. We weren't lovers, not officially, but something between us felt fragile, like a firefly in a jar. It glowed with possibility, and I was afraid to name it out loud, afraid it might vanish. At the time, I thought she was the best thing that had ever happened to me. After we secured our first seed round, things escalated. We moved out of the garage and into a co-working space in downtown San Francisco. Suddenly, there were interns, product managers, even a receptionist. The company was growing, and with growth came pressure. Investors wanted updates. Metrics had to be met. Retention, churn, burn rate, these weren't just buzzwords anymore, they were lifelines. I found myself drowning in code and technical architecture. I barely had time to breathe, let alone handle the business side. So when Alina proposed that she take over as CEO while I stayed on as CTO, it felt like the right call. She framed it as a temporary move, just to help us get through the next funding round. I agreed without hesitation. Of course I did. She had earned it, I thought. She was smart, driven, and had done so much already. She could be the face while I stayed behind the curtain. We signed some paperwork, drafted new roles, and made it official. That night I stood in our empty office long after everyone had left. The city lights outside flickered through the glass walls, casting moving shadows on the floor. I remember staring at Alina's nameplate, Chief Executive Officer, and feeling a strange mix of pride and unease. I told myself it was just change. Change was good. Growth always came with discomfort. But deep down, something shifted that day. From that point on, Alina took more and more control of our outward direction. She was on panels, on podcasts, in tech magazines. She was brilliant and articulate, and people loved her. Our brand became synonymous with her image. Investors wanted to talk to her. Clients requested her by name. Meanwhile, I slipped further into the shadows, the man behind the code, invisible to the outside world. Still, I reminded myself why I started this. It wasn't about ego. It wasn't about fame. It was about solving a real problem, and we were doing it. Our user base grew from 100 to 100,000 in just over a year. Revenue climbed. We made it to TechCrunch. There were offers, interest, buzz. And I still trusted her, even when she stopped updating me on certain investor meetings, even when she began arriving late to the office or canceling our regular sync-ups. I told myself she was just busy. She was carrying the weight of the company on her shoulders. I wanted to believe that. I remember one particular evening, alone in the office, scrolling through an article that praised Alina as the visionary behind FinMap. Not once did it mention me. Not my name, not my contribution, not the code I'd written or the nights I'd sacrificed. It stung, but I swallowed it. I wasn't in this for credit. I was in this because I believed in what we built. But something about that article haunted me. It planted a seed of doubt that I couldn't quite shake. I wish I had paid more attention to that feeling. Because in the months that followed, everything I knew, everything I had built, would start to unravel. And it would all begin with one signature, one dotted line I hadn't read closely enough. The same line that made her CEO, and the line that gave her the power to take everything away. The day we signed the Series B funding round was supposed to be a triumph. We had raised $10 million at a valuation I never thought we'd see in just a few years. The office was buzzing with energy, champagne glasses clinked, balloons floated in the break room, and people toasted to the next chapter of our journey. But I didn't feel like celebrating. Somewhere in the corners of that brightly lit office, I felt the shadows tightening. I watched Alina move from group to group, laughing with investors and posing for pictures beside the new company banner. She looked radiant, confident, utterly in control. And she was. That was the truth I hadn't wanted to face. This was her stage now. I was just the man in the background, the one who got us here but no longer seemed essential to where we were going. After the funding closed, our board expanded. New investors brought new voices, voices that didn't know me, didn't value the sleepless nights I had poured into FinMap's foundation. Alina began speaking about strategy and scaling with them directly. Sometimes I'd find out about major company decisions secondhand, through Slack threads or third-party memos. I tried to rationalize it. She was busy, we were growing, hierarchies were a natural evolution of scaling up, but in my gut I knew I was being sidelined, slowly, systematically. And then came Carter. Carter and I had a long history. We were roommates in college, studied computer science together, shared late-night pizza and debugging marathons. When I first pitched FinMap to him, he passed on joining, said he didn't want the uncertainty, so I went it alone. Now, 3 years later, he suddenly appeared. Alina brought him in as an advisor, a strategic asset who had connections in enterprise sales. I didn't object publicly. What could I say? At first, I thought it was just business. Carter came in, hosted a few webinars, opened some doors, but then I noticed he was in more meetings than me. He started visiting Alina's office late in the evenings. Their laughter echoed down the hallway long after everyone else had left. The two of them shared a rhythm, an inside language that I couldn't decipher. I felt like an intruder in my own company. I drowned myself in product development, pushing new features, optimizing our mobile version, experimenting with AI integrations. If I couldn't be at the forefront of the company anymore, at least I could ensure the product remained stellar. That's what I told myself. That was the only way I could make peace with my diminishing voice. But it didn't stop the erosion. A few weeks later, I received a calendar invite titled Org Structure Review. It was from Alina, and it included Carter, not me. I wasn't even in the original thread. I had been forwarded it by a junior engineer who was confused about the new reporting hierarchy. That's how I found out I had been effectively demoted. My title remained Chief Technology Officer, but responsibilities were siphoned away piece by piece. Product roadmap discussions moved to a new growth committee, which didn't include me. Carter was now listed as Chief Strategy Officer. The team I had built, mentored, and defended during crunch weeks no longer reported to me directly. The pain wasn't just professional, it was personal. I had given Alina the reins because I trusted her, admired her. I had believed in her not just as a leader but as a person who saw me, who respected me. But respect had turned into condescension. Every conversation we did have was wrapped in the language of politeness but hollow, transactional. She no longer asked how I was doing. She didn't need to. At some point, I stopped going into the office every day. I told myself I was working remotely, focusing on deep architecture work. But the truth was, I couldn't stand being in that space anymore. My own company had become foreign territory. And then came the acquisition rumors. It started as whispers, mentions in tech circles, passing references from friends in other startups. A large fintech conglomerate was allegedly looking to acquire us. I hadn't heard it from Alina. I hadn't seen a single email or presentation, but I knew it was true. The signs were everywhere, confidential meetings behind closed doors, hush-hush calendar blocks, legal consultants popping in and out of Slack. One night, unable to sleep, I logged into our investor relations dashboard. The permissions had changed. I could no longer access full reports. My admin rights were stripped. That was when it hit me. This wasn't negligence. This wasn't oversight. This was a deliberate lockout. Still, I hoped, irrationally, that Alina would come to me, that she would sit down and explain, that she would remember what we built together, that I wasn't just code and silence, I was the reason FinMap existed. She didn't. Instead, I received a cold, carefully worded email. It confirmed the acquisition was moving forward. The board had voted. A controlling interest had approved the deal. The company would be absorbed into the larger entity by end of quarter. My role would become consultative during the transition. I stared at that email for over an hour, reread it 20 times. Every sentence was a knife. No gratitude, no acknowledgement, just a clean, clinical extraction. But the final blow came days later. Alina and Carter announced their engagement. They posted a picture from Lake Tahoe, sunset in the background, their silhouettes locked in embrace. The caption read, "From co-founders to co-dreamers, here S to forever." I remember feeling physically ill. I closed my laptop, left the apartment, and walked for hours through the city. Everything around me felt artificial: neon lights, honking cars, laughter from restaurant patios. I walked until my feet ached, until the ache in my chest matched the one in my legs. How had I been so blind? How had I allowed myself to be displaced not just from my company, but from the very narrative I helped author? In the weeks that followed, I fulfilled my consultative duties like a ghost. I attended meetings without speaking. I nodded at decisions I had no part in. I signed documents I barely read. There was no fight left in me, just a numb resolve to see it through. The acquisition closed, money transferred, everyone celebrated. And I disappeared. No farewell party, no press release, no goodbye from Alina. Just a line item in a spreadsheet, founder turned footnote. But I wasn't gone, not really. I went somewhere quiet, somewhere no one would look. I took a leave of absence from the noise, from the betrayal, from the image of their perfect lives. I lived in silence, licked my wounds, and sat with my pain. And slowly, without fanfare, something started to stir again inside me. A small ember, a whisper that said, "This isn't the end. This is the beginning of something else." Something that wouldn't be taken from me again. I retreated from everything. From the tech scene, from social media, from the identity I had spent years building. There was no formal plan, no strategy. I just knew I needed space. I rented a cabin in the northern hills of California near Mendocino, surrounded by redwoods and silence. The kind of silence that made your thoughts louder, inescapable. At first, it was unbearable. I'd wake up disoriented, as if I'd been cut off from the world mid-sentence. My body still expected Slack notifications, calendar pings, back-to-back meetings. But there was none of that. Just the rustle of wind through the trees and the distant sound of water from a nearby creek. My mind, however, was still stuck in rewind, replaying boardroom moments, rereading old messages, reconstructing timelines, trying to pinpoint the exact moment trust turned into betrayal. There's a kind of mourning that comes when something intangible is taken from you. It's not like a breakup or a death. It's more subtle, more insidious. I mourned the version of myself that used to believe in people without reservation. The man who looked at Alina and saw possibility, not premeditation. I had to face the truth that I hadn't just lost a company or a partner. I had lost an entire worldview. It would have been easy to stay bitter, to let resentment calcify into cynicism, but that wasn't who I wanted to become. I knew if I let that happen, if I let their betrayal define me, then they'd win twice. So instead, I chose to rebuild, slowly, quietly, from within. Every morning, I forced myself into a routine. Wake up at 6, make coffee, read something non-technical, meditate even if just for 10 minutes. Then write, journaling first, just unfiltered thoughts, then eventually code. Not for anyone, not for a product, just code for the sake of logic and structure. It reminded me of why I fell in love with it in the first place. The clarity, the control. In code, unlike in life, things made sense. It took weeks before I stopped checking FinMap's status online. At first, I couldn't help myself. I'd Google it late at night, looking for signs that the acquisition had failed or that user feedback was tanking. But nothing of the sort came. The merger was deemed a success. Alina and Carter were now co-heads of the innovation team at the parent company. They were featured in Forbes' 35 under 35. I didn't correct the narrative. I let the world believe what it wanted. Instead, I started listening to founders again. Not the ones on magazine covers, but the ones in the trenches, newbies trying to build something meaningful with limited resources and sleepless nights. I joined anonymous forums offering feedback under a pseudonym. I beta tested early apps, gave UI critiques, helped debug back-end issues for strangers. It was through one of those interactions that I met someone named Mina. She was building a nonprofit platform to help students from low-income backgrounds access micro-scholarships and mentorships. Her code was messy, her roadmap non-existent, but her vision, pure, honest. She reminded me of myself, of who I used to be before everything got corrupted by ambition and betrayal. I helped her clean up the codebase, refactored her authentication flow, set up a proper CI/CD pipeline. At first, she didn't know who I was just Gray Fox 12, a handle I had used since college. But over time, we started talking beyond the code, about burnout, purpose, and the fine line between hustle and self-destruction. She didn't know it, but she was helping me too. I started to regain clarity. Purpose wasn't about scale or exits. It was about impact, about building something that mattered, even if only to a few people. I remembered that the best parts of FinMap weren't the numbers. It was the single mom who emailed us saying our app helped her get out of debt, or the freelancer who finally understood cash flow because of our simple visuals. That was the legacy I wanted to chase, not valuations or headlines. So I began writing again, this time a blog, still anonymously. I titled it Founder Fallout. Each post was an unvarnished piece of my journey, what it felt like to be betrayed, what it meant to let go, how to rebuild when no one believes in you anymore. I didn't expect much, but the posts resonated. Comments flooded in. People shared their own stories of co-founders who stole IP, of investors who pushed them out, of being ghosted by teams they built from scratch. The blog gained traction. Within months, it became a quiet lighthouse for the disillusioned. I wasn't alone anymore, and neither were they. I realized that pain, when shared honestly, could become a bridge instead of a wall. Around the same time, Mina introduced me to a small collective of engineers and designers working on social good projects. They weren't flashy. No VC backing, no buzzwords, just real people trying to solve real problems. They invited me to join their retreats, brainstorming sessions, late-night hackathons. For the first time in years, I felt welcome, not as a name or a title, but as a person. It was during one of those hackathons that the idea for my next venture came. I wasn't planning it. I wasn't looking to build again. But something about the project, helping refugees verify credentials through blockchain, sparked something inside me. Not because it was trendy, but because it was needed. I stayed up for 36 hours straight writing the initial architecture. When I presented it to the group, they were stunned, not just by the code, but by the clarity of vision. They asked me to lead the technical team. I said yes with one condition: no titles, no CEOs or CTOs, just builders. We called it Beacon, and for the first time in a long while I felt peace, not the kind that comes from revenge or vindication, but the quiet kind, the kind that comes from alignment between what you do and who you are. Looking back, I realized something. FinMap was my first love, but it wasn't my last. Elena didn't destroy me. She just revealed what I had been blind to about trust, about power, about the cost of silence. And Carter, he was never really a friend. He was a mirror reflecting my own naivety back at me. I kept all the journal entries, all the emails, all the drafts I wrote and never sent. Not because I wanted to weaponize them, but because they reminded me of the price I paid. A price I would never pay again. Beacon didn't raise millions, it didn't go viral. But it changed lives. It helped people in war-torn regions prove who they were. It gave children access to schools. It reconnected families. And to me, that meant more than any exit ever could. One day, as I walked through a refugee center where Beacon had just launched a new pilot, a teenage girl came up to me. She had no idea who I was, just that I had helped build a tool that made her feel seen. And in that moment, I realized I was free. Free from the version of success the world had sold me. Free from needing Elena or Carter to validate my worth. Free from the bitterness that once tethered me to a story I no longer needed to tell. Because I was finally living a new one. My own months passed. Beacon grew not explosively, not with headlines or ticker symbols, but steadily and meaningfully. It didn't feel like a company, it felt like a movement, and that made all the difference. We didn't dress for pitches. We didn't worry about valuations or exit strategies. I kept my name out of everything. No interviews, no profiles, no LinkedIn updates. I wasn't hiding. I was choosing anonymity over ego, impact over visibility. For once, I didn't need to be seen. I needed to build. But even in the stillness of purpose, the past found ways to resurface. I remember the exact moment it did. I was reviewing a security audit for a new blockchain node we were deploying in Jordan when I received a message from an old college friend, David, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. His note was short, almost apologetic. He said he had seen something I should be aware of. A link followed. It was a video clip, Alina and Carter, now co-hosting a new tech podcast, speaking about the early days of FinMap and their journey as co-founders. In it, they glossed over my name entirely, referring to me obliquely as a brilliant developer who helped us in the early phase. Helped us. The words rang in my ears like a gong. Helped us. As if I hadn't built the entire infrastructure, as if I hadn't bled for every line of code, as if I were just a freelancer they paid and forgot. They laughed through stories I remembered living differently. Stories where I stayed up for 72 hours straight while Carter was vacationing in Chalum. Stories where Alina cried in my arms after our first investor backed out, long before she wore tailored suits and called herself a visionary. They edited the past into a palatable myth that suited their new image. Polished, sanitized, convenient. I closed the video. I didn't need to see more. For the first time in many months, something hot and old stirred in my chest. Rage, betrayal, not just at the act of omission, but at the ease with which they erased me. History, it turns out, isn't written by the winners. It's written by those who speak the loudest once the dust settles. But I didn't respond. I didn't reach out. I didn't demand credit. Because I had learned that some wars aren't worth fighting, not because they're unwinnable, but because they cost too much of the soul to even try. Instead, I wrote. That night I penned an essay titled The Founder Who Vanished and posted it anonymously to my blog. I didn't name names, I didn't accuse or defame. I simply told the truth, the shape of betrayal, the anatomy of erasure, the slow corrosion of trust beneath a veneer of partnership. The post went viral. Thousands read it. Hundreds reached out. Some guessed who it was about. Many didn't. But the message was clear. I wasn't the only one. This was a pattern. After that, media outlets began reaching out. They wanted interviews, exposés, follow-ups. They wanted drama. But I declined them all. I wasn't interested in revenge disguised as journalism. My story didn't need a megaphone, it needed a lesson. And yet life has a strange rhythm. Just when you think you've closed a chapter, something opens again. I was invited to speak at a closed-door forum on ethical tech in Geneva. No press, no cameras, just builders and policymakers. I almost said no. But Beacon had just completed a successful pilot program in Ethiopia, and one of our partners insisted my presence would help unlock further international collaboration. So I went. The event was intimate, about 50 people. I gave a presentation on decentralized identity verification and its potential to aid displaced populations. My focus was technical, clinical, but during the Q&A, an older gentleman, a senior advisor to the UN, asked me, "What motivates you to build systems that serve those with no power?" I paused. The room was quiet. I could have given a rehearsed answer about justice or systemic inequality, but instead I said something unexpected, even to myself. Because once I gave my power away. I trusted the wrong people, and I learned that to serve others you first have to reclaim what you lost. The room remained silent, not out of judgment, but resonance. That night, several attendees came to me privately, sharing their own stories of loss, of betrayal, of rediscovery. For the first time in public, I felt seen not as the man who had disappeared from FinMap, but as someone who had survived and grown. I returned to California with a renewed clarity. Not vengeful, not bitter, but rooted. I knew who I was again. I didn't need the world to know, I just needed to keep building. Beacon expanded. We added multilingual AI-driven interfaces. We partnered with grassroots organizations instead of governments to ensure data integrity and trust. We launched satellite teams in Southeast Asia and Eastern Europe. Impact scaled, quietly and meaningfully. One morning I received a letter, yes, a physical letter hand-delivered by courier. The envelope was thick, embossed. The sender, Alina. The return address was a Manhattan high-rise. Inside was a single page, handwritten. She said she had read the essay. She didn't apologize directly, but she acknowledged it. Said she recognized parts of herself in the unnamed characters, that she had made decisions she couldn't take back, but that she wanted me to know she remembered. Not just the facts, but the feeling, the nights in the garage, the dreams shared in the quiet. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't seek closure. She just remembered. I sat with that letter for hours. Then I folded it back into the envelope and placed it inside a drawer, alongside the only remaining object from the old FinMap office. My first wireframe sketch, smudged and coffee-stained. I didn't hate her anymore. I didn't miss her either. What I felt was something else, liberation. Because when the past no longer controls the present, it becomes just that, the past. And I was living forward now. I had another call in 10 minutes. A founder in Nairobi needed help refining a grant proposal. After that, I had to review a smart contract draft from our Istanbul team. Beacon was growing. The work never stopped. But I wouldn't have it any other way. Because I had built something again. Something no one could sell. Something no one could take. Something that would outlive me, not as a brand or a stock ticker, but as a quiet ripple in the fabric of good. And this time, my name didn't need to be on it. Because I knew it was mine. By the time Beacon reached its third year, we had become more than just a tool. We had become a network, a philosophy, a quiet revolution in how identity, trust, and impact were handled in the digital age. We weren't backed by billion-dollar funds or celebrated by the mainstream press, but our footprint stretched across continents. Our team operated like a decentralized organism, each node capable, autonomous, and intrinsically motivated. There was no defining moment when I realized I had moved on from FinMap. It wasn't like flipping a switch. It was gradual, like fog lifting slowly over the hills at sunrise, revealing what was always there beneath. One day I caught myself laughing without guilt. Another day I slept without dreams of betrayal. Little by little, I reclaimed myself. My days were full. Mornings began with global check-ins, brief synchronous videos from our regional leads outlining progress, roadblocks, and needs. Then hours of code reviews, white paper revisions, partnership calls, or mentoring newer team members. In the evenings, I often wrote, not just for the blog, which still ran strong, but essays, reflections, and technical thought pieces. They carried no byline. I didn't want the spotlight, I wanted clarity. But something else began to stir around this time. Invitations, not from press or influencers, but from universities, ethical funding organizations, and grassroots coalitions. They wanted me to speak, to share insights, not about startup hustle or fundraising strategies, but about failure, rebuilding, and the ethics of creation. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who once lost everything to blind trust was now being asked how to lead with integrity. I accepted a few, quietly, anonymously in some cases. I presented behind screens or through voice-only forums. My name became less important than the message, and yet the invitations kept coming. Then one day, something unexpected happened. An email landed in my inbox from a publishing house, a well-regarded one. They had followed my anonymous blog, pieced together my identity, and wanted to offer me a book deal. They didn't ask for gossip or scandal. They wanted a memoir, something raw, something human. They believed that my story could help a generation of builders who were burning out, selling out, or breaking down in pursuit of success. I hesitated. A book meant visibility. It meant reopening wounds. It meant inviting speculation, scrutiny, even attack. But it also meant reclaiming authorship, not of the past, but of the meaning I assigned to it. So I agreed. On one condition, it would not be a tell-all, it would be a tell-true. The writing took a year. I wrote during long flights, in hotel rooms, in the corner of a quiet library in Mendocino. The manuscript became something more than a record. It was a reassembly, a stitching together of the man I had become from the fragments of who I had been. The book launched under the title, Still Here, Notes from a Founder Who Stayed. No flashy marketing, no author tour, just a quiet release through independent channels. But somehow it found its way. Readers responded. Thousands of messages poured in. Founders, designers, teachers, activists, even people who had never started a business but had started over. They saw themselves in the ache, in the rebuilding, in the silence between the milestones. It was never about the betrayal, it was about what we choose to do with the pain afterward. Then came the interview requests, not from gossip sites, but from thought leaders, ethics panels, and education platforms. One of them stood out, a university that wanted to build a curriculum around ethical innovation, and they asked if I would come teach a workshop. At first, I declined, but they persisted. Eventually, I agreed to one session under one condition: no cameras, no live streaming, and no titles. I wasn't coming as a former founder or a success story. I was coming as someone who had learned, sometimes brutally, what not to do. The class was small, a dozen students, each wide-eyed and buzzing with untested ideas. They expected frameworks, hacks, shortcuts. What they got instead was silence, then a story. I told them about trust, about watching something you loved turn into something you couldn't recognize, about handing over power without safeguards, about rebuilding, not for revenge, but for truth. I didn't mention names, I didn't need to. What mattered was the lesson. After the class, one student approached me. She had tears in her eyes. She said she had been on the verge of dropping out, convinced that the startup world had no space for kindness, for conscience. But something in my words made her reconsider. That night, walking through the campus, I realized something profound. We never really heal by erasing the past. We heal by integrating it, by making it a chapter, not the entire book. Beacon continued to evolve. We launched an education initiative, helping communities use our technology to train their own developers, creating jobs alongside identity. We partnered with a decentralized cooperative in South America. We launched a pilot in a Ukrainian refugee camp. Each step felt more aligned, more sustainable. We had no press team. We had no brand ambassadors, but we had a heartbeat that never wavered. Then one day, out of the blue, a notification arrived on an old email I rarely checked. It was a press release. Elena and Carter had left their parent company. No scandal, no fanfare, just a brief mention. The co-heads of the innovation division have stepped down to pursue personal ventures. I stared at the screen for a long time, not out of glee, not out of curiosity, but contemplation. They were free now, too. Maybe they were searching for what I had already found, quiet purpose, truth beyond the persona. I never reached out, and they never contacted me. It was better that way. Some stories don't need reunion, they need distance. And some closures don't come with confrontation, they come with peace. A few weeks later, I sat at the edge of a cliff in Big Sur, watching the sun melt into the Pacific. I thought of that garage, of Elena's laughter, of Carter's handshake, of the silence that followed. I thought of Beacon, of Mina, of the refugee girl who hugged me without knowing my name. I thought of the students who asked if integrity was still possible in tech. And I smiled, because I knew the answer. I had lived it. And I was still here. There is a quiet rhythm to life after loss that few ever talk about. Not the dramatic, cinematic kind, but the gentle, almost imperceptible one, the subtle choreography of breath and stillness that forms when grief has exhausted its fire and left behind the embers of resilience. That's where I lived in the months that followed my last trip to Big Sur. In the hush. Beacon kept growing. Our pilots turned into permanent implementations. Countries I had never stepped foot in now held systems that bore our open-source code, adapted, remixed, reimagined. It was no longer mine, and that was the best part. What we started had transcended us. It belonged to those it served. I spent less and less time at the center of operations. I trained new leaders, younger, hungrier, more diverse. They brought perspectives I didn't have and didn't need to fake. I gave them space. Sometimes I would go days without checking in, and the world kept turning. The systems didn't fall apart. That's how I knew we had built something real. I returned to the cabin more often, the one in Mendocino. It had become a sacred space, a reminder of the version of myself who had once crawled there to heal. I still had the old sketch of FinMap pinned to a corkboard in the corner, right above the desk where I had written the memoir. Not as a bitter token, but as a reminder. Not all seeds grow where you plant them. Some crack open only after being buried by time and distance. In that silence, I began reflecting on something unexpected. Forgiveness. Not the kind you announce, not the kind that requires anyone else to be involved, but the private, internal kind, the kind that releases your nervous system from years of tension. That tells your bones you don't have to fight anymore. I had held onto fragments of Carter and Elena, not out of love or hatred, but as emotional placeholders, proof that what happened was real, that I wasn't naive for feeling betrayed. But I had outgrown that need. I no longer replayed their decisions or tried to untangle their motives. I no longer fantasized about a reckoning or justice. I just wanted peace. And I had it. It came in the form of small moments, standing barefoot on cold soil at sunrise, receiving a message from a young developer in Lagos saying Beacon's documentation helped her launch her first app, hearing my own laughter over dinner with friends who had never known me as the founder of FinMap, just as me. When I finally cleared out the last drawer in that cabin, I found a notebook I hadn't touched in years. Inside were pages from the very first iteration of Beacon, scribbled ideas about identity and dignity, and on the back page, in my own frantic handwriting, the sentence, "Build something no one can steal from you." I had done that, and it was time to do something else. The announcement wasn't public. It didn't need to be. I drafted a simple internal memo to our leadership team. I would be stepping away permanently from day-to-day operations. No title, no emeritus role, just stepping aside. They responded with gratitude, not grief, because they were ready, and so was I. I handed off all credentials, burned the old hard drives, archived the journals. I left the final decision logs and vision maps in the care of a new steward, the kind of leader I once hoped to be. And with that, I walked away. I didn't vanish, I just changed orbit. I started mentoring young builders full-time, outside of Beacon. Kids with no pedigree, no investors, no pedigree, just stubborn hope and messy prototypes. I worked from libraries, train stations, under leafy trees in public parks. I said no to all press, no to panels, no to awards. Because I had already received what I came for. Redemption doesn't always look like applause. Sometimes it's a bench in a park where a 19-year-old founder finally understands the value of ethics. Sometimes it's a phone call from someone who read your book and decided not to give up. Sometimes it's silence, earned, clean, holy. Years later, I found myself back in San Francisco. Not for business, just passing through. I walked by the building where FinMap had once had its offices. It was now a wellness spa. I smiled. Something about that felt perfect. I didn't stop, I didn't linger. I had no ghosts left to visit. I ended that day at a tiny used bookstore near North Beach. A copy of Still Here sat on a bottom shelf, wedged between two novels. Its spine was cracked, pages underlined. I opened to a dog-eared section where someone had scribbled. I thought I was alone, I'm not. I closed the book gently and left it there. That night back at my hotel, I watched the fog roll in. The same fog that had once surrounded me in confusion, in heartbreak and isolation. It no longer felt suffocating. It felt like a blanket, familiar, kind. I wrote a final entry in my personal journal. You were broken, then you built, then you let go, and in doing so you became whole. I closed the journal, placed it on the windowsill, and let the night carry it away. Because the story was over. And I was home,